World of Warcraft revealed a new assistance tool, you may have heard of it, the one-button rotation, quote-unquote, which has of course led to the questions, could we have that in Final Fantasy XIV? And would it even work in Final Fantasy XIV? Let's talk about that. Let's start with what this feature actually is going to be, or is, in case it already fully released by the time this video releases. This assistance feature is twofold. First, you can set it so the next button it recommends that you use will glow. Some of you might now be thinking, wow, we have that already, but no, not quite. It would glow just one button so you know exactly where to go next, rather than glowing, I don't know, 5 buttons depending on context. Second, an actual singular button that will use the exact action it recommends all on its own is also added. Using this button adds 0.2 seconds to the GCD as a small penalty for using it. That might not sound like much when Final Fantasy XIV's GCD starts at 2.50 baseline, and speed stats are overall not great for most jobs. However, in World of Warcraft, the base GCD is 1.5, and it is, to my knowledge, relatively unlikely you have no haste, so it is perfectly possible it is actually 1.4, or faster, making the 0.2 penalty more significant. Now, something that makes WoW very different from 14 is that every specialization, better comparable to a job than a whole WoW class, has a huge amount of options in regards to talents, including active and passive effects, additions to actions, and so on. Meaning that if we for a moment ignore the fact that many players will simply use the optimal templates, it is possible that any 2 fire mages would play with distinctly different talent choices. Whether they are visibly distinct is another story. Because of this, what the optimal rotation is in WoW can vary a lot more. Sometimes the optimal depends on which talents you picked, and what is optimal there can depend on the particular content you are in. A dungeon might call for different choices than a single target boss fight. Sometimes you might also just simply have a personal preference. What really matters about this is that an assistance tool that tells you what to press, and a single button that, well, presses it for you, how would it actually know what is best? Given the possible nuances that can be in a rotation, it is perfectly possible that a single button just cannot take into account all the necessary parts to do that. There will probably be an optimal build to make use of this singular button. Something that is worth mentioning that has been stated about this feature is that it is not going to use like big cooldowns for you, or interrupt or stun, or even move for you, obviously. Anyway, how well that will work, and how well it seems to work, is a whole separate can of worms, and is, to be perfectly honest, besides the point. This video is not about dunking on additions to WoW, but rather discussing the idea that maybe 14 could use this kind of feature too. So let's start with that. Imagine if Final Fantasy XIV got a feature you could turn on that would actually make the next button you should press, outside of niche exceptions, glow. Not that dashed line nonsense we call glowing, like actually the button flashes up and glows to make it stand out. Simultaneously, a single button is added that effectively presses the button for you, but when used it causes the GCD to be increased by a flat 0.2. Arguably, maybe it should be more than 0.2, because the base GCD in this game is longer, but at the same time, by extension of the GCD being longer, it would also delay your OGCD somewhat, so it probably adds up. Both of these features could massively improve accessibility for the game. Absolutely no doubt about it. In fact, I think this would be the biggest selling point of this feature, by far. So let's focus on that for now. It was stated by Blizzard that this single button will not handle major offensive cooldowns, which, when translated to 14, presumably could mean that while it could perform the entirety of the summoner rotation in some order, it would skip over Searing Light, letting you figure that one out yourself. It's also possible certain other cooldowns would be skipped. If we stay in Summoner Land for a moment, perhaps Energy Drain and Necrotize is skipped. Possibly even Summon Bahamut. So, admittedly, exactly how a feature like this would look in Final Fantasy XIV might be a bit difficult to determine. World of Warcraft has two specific advantages in the implementation of a system like this. 1. Most attacks are GZDs. 2. There is no such thing as a quote-unquote animation lock after using an action. If something is GZD, it is finished being performed the exact frame it goes out the door. And if something is OGZD, then you can use it whenever you want, with the express exception that if you're casting, you can't. Unless that OGZD says you can anyway. Yes, that is sometimes a thing. Ice flows, anyone? Regardless of how much such a button, or system in the case of the glowy button, would assist you with the rotation, the place where it would absolutely be appreciated is with players that have a physical or mental disability that one way or another inhibits their ability to play the game effectively. Just mashing this one button might well improve the performance of some players. Some players that simply cannot be bothered to learn the intricacies of a job may also find a tool like this immensely helpful. Some time ago, I put out a video about the players that refuse to learn the tricks of the game. Arguably, if you ever tried playing a job thinking, I have no interest in this, I just want the achievement for leveling it, then you could probably get by reasonably well by just pressing the funny rotation button and just get it over with, and still do enough damage that no one would complain. Or what? Which then leads to the possible downsides or negatives of a system like this. I recognize that this was one single positive, but I do think it's a huge one. Nothing to be sneezed at, but there are a lot of possible concerns or potential issues with a system like this, which I feel is worth at least mentioning. The first issue that comes to mind for me is simply a mechanical one. If we assume the funny button actually plays rotation completely, which would mean everything, then it is worth considering that some jobs sorta need to be at certain points in rotation, which they would, on a normal paced rotation, reach naturally by simply going through the motions. However, take a summoner for instance. It would not be possible to fit 6 impulses inside Bahamut unless you stacked enough spell speed that your actual GCD was closer to 2.28 or 2.27 to offset the 0.2 increase from the funny button. Additionally, over the course of the 1 minute sort of looping rotation of the job, a summoner would straight up lose somewhere between 2 and 3 GCDs to get to everything. It could be argued this isn't too bad. The lost GCDs could be Ruby Right and that single Ruin 3 you'd naturally cast. And if Slipstream is forcibly swift casted, that would mean the whole rotation is without cast times. It would still cause some issues. The reason World of Warcraft doesn't quite observe such an issue on their end is because specializations tend to have a more flexible and fluid design with more random elements. So exactly when you burst or use something varies. Where in 14, part of the reason why so many jobs hate speed stats is because it ruins the perfect alignment of a 2.5 second GCD with exclusively cooldowns that are a multiple of 5 seconds. Obviously, this issue could just not be a problem. Let's say the system is implemented without a punishment. It's just 2.5 second GCD on a button. The assumed weakness of the button is that it makes it harder to perfectly optimize your rotation. The single button does not know that Viper would benefit from holding that reawaken. It just full sends when it sees 50 gauge. It doesn't deal with positionals either, that's your problem. This could lead to its own issues, since now the one button might be superior to players that are legitimately performing the rotation with only minor mistakes. The second issue that comes to mind for me is related to viability. A melee DPS could realistically just turbo smash the one button constantly. As long as they are in melee range, it should work, although maybe not Samurai or Reaper with their casts every now and then. A ranged physical could also simply button mash this singular button. However, if the next spell the automated rotation decides on has a cast time as, say, a mage DPS, then you simply have to know and see that coming and then stop to cast. It might be difficult for the one button to know in advance that actually you need to put in some instance for an upcoming mechanic. This means that this single button solution would heavily favor ranged physical jobs, as well as melees without cast times, so probably not Reaper or Samurai. Furthermore, even if a tank could easily play its offensive rotation with this single button, freeing up attention to do everything else yourself, it certainly won't be as helpful for a tank than for a DPS, again favoring a DPS slot. And finally, naturally, it is relatively unlikely the one button can determine the best way to heal as a healer. The fact that a button like this favors a DPS role is not really the problem, but more so that it might make the step from playing DPS to trying the other roles even steeper. The third potential issue that comes to mind for me is related to the perceived convenience of such a button. The first benefit I heard people mention of this one button solution, even before accessibility, was the suggestion that if you can play any job reasonably well by just mashing one button, then jobs can be made much more complex without it being a big deal. My perspective on this is that indeed, yes, some jobs in 14 could definitely stomach a bit more complexity with no issues. However, if a job is made super complicated, but you can play it okay with the one button, so it's alright, it would make the learning curve of picking up the job actually extremely difficult. A key thing to keep in mind is that having a button that just performs the rotation for you does not teach you the rotation very well, if at all. In the past, add-ons in World of Warcraft that were made to basically tell you what to press would typically show the recommended action alongside what is coming up next, as well as, sometimes, other options that might also be worth considering. For 14 example, a summoner summons Ifrit, the hypothetical add-on shows use Ruby Right, but next to it, it shows up next, also Ruby Right. But on the other side, it also shows Ruin 4 and Crimson Cyclone as alternatives to consider. This kind of idea is because just being told what to do next is often not even remotely enough information, and also because, due to the limitations of such an add-on, it might not be able to see any contexts necessary to make the best choice. And sometimes the player would have to be its eyes and course correct as necessary. Furthermore, a single button rotation like this might be telling you what to do for a specific reason, but that reason is unlikely to be communicated well. The single button would probably be capable of playing a perfect standard Black Mage rotation on a striking dummy without failure, but it would not be able to explain to you why you do X and not Y, so you can learn how to adjust when needed. This would, in essence, possibly make the chasm between the average players and the best players even greater, but perhaps not for the right reasons. The fourth potential issue I can think of is an extension of the third. Let's say, for the sake of example, that the one button rotation could perform your rotation perfectly on its own to, say, 95% effectiveness. This can lead to a situation where players that are not good enough to surpass that 95% effectiveness may either feel forced to use the one button or may be socially pressured to. Similarly, if that is good enough, a lot of players that might have found it fun to play the rotations quote-unquote properly might simply not care to even bother. A lot of players would simply lean towards the path of least resistance, so it makes natural sense this could happen. An additional, mildly humorous result of a single button rotation like this is that we would no longer even be remotely uncertain what is defined as the standard rotation, as the button itself would perform it. Anything beyond might one day be called non-standard. In fact, not using the button, if it is good enough, might be considered non-standard. Could you imagine that? In fact, an even darker potential endgame could be that if the one-button rotation becomes popular enough, jobs might be adjusted to fit it better specifically, rather than the suggestion that since the button is here, the jobs could have a more complex and deeper potential. Now, with all that said, I still want to reiterate that the possible accessibility offered by having a single button to perform your rotation for you could be amazing. While we may sometimes convince ourselves that the majority of the players are big tryhards that want to play real good, I think it is a much more likely reality that the average player of Final Fantasy XIV enjoys the overall experience, whether the story, the universe, the art, the social aspects, and might be happy enough with a single button that makes them look cool. And that's not meant to be derogatory. A game like Final Fantasy XIV has all sorts of players, and this button would definitely even the playing field for a lot of players, at least in more casual content. However, I felt the need to discuss this topic because I've heard a lot of people that only see the positives, and so really want to see Final Fantasy XIV also get this. With this sort of perspective of advantages and disadvantages that such a button could provide for Final Fantasy XIV, what do you think about it? Do you think it would be great if this game also got a single button to play a standard rotation? Or do you think it is better that players have to play themselves and overcome that challenge of figuring it out? Please do let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, the average potency per GCD of the looping rotation of a Black Mage, ignoring Thunder and Xenoglossy, including Swift-casted B3s and AF1 F3Ps, is approximately 527. By comparison, an Ice Mage would replace all of it with just Blizzard 4 at 300 potency. This means this quote-unquote one-button rotation would be about 57% of the power of a proper rotation, quote-unquote.